this is a paper on whether household inflation expectations help predict inflation, and it's joint work with my co-authors that I met, Brandao, Marques, Gaston, Gelos, David Hofman, Julia Otten, and Strauss. And as usual, anything I say today are my own views, not those of the panel. So we all know that inflation started increasing sometime in the spring of 2021, and this increase initially was driven by a multitude of factors, including the strong demand from the recovery from the pandemic, the supply shock also related to the pandemic, the supply constraints, as well as the substantial policy stimulus that was undertaken by many countries across the globe, both monetary and fiscal policy stimulus. And of course, the Russia's war in Ukraine compounded all of these pressures as well. And so there was a sharp jump in energy and food prices, but gradually inflation became much more broad-based. And you all know what happened after. We're still waiting to see it come back down to 2%. Now, even if some of the supply shocks initially and some of the other factors that were caused the increase in inflation proved temporary and faded over time, the fact is that inflation has proved very persistent since then. And the challenge of bringing inflation down becomes much more formidable if inflation expectations de-anchor. And so if you look at this chart, it plots the observed inflation, that is a blue line in the US, and the median household expectations, the orange line over there, as well as the median consensus forecast and the market professional forecast and the market-based expectations, which is really what's put out by Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. And what you see is that these measures of inflation expectations started increasing along with inflation. Actually, household inflation expectation increase predated the latest surge in inflation. And while they've come down a little bit very recently, especially in 2023, they are far from where they used to be before the pandemic. So what we do in this paper is we focus on household inflation expectations. Now, these expectations are less discussed in literature than inflation expectations of markets and professional forecasters, but they may also be important. Household inflation expectations, they've shown empirically to matter for household consumption, saving, financing decisions, as well as home ownership decisions. And they may also impact wage negotiations and labor supply. Theoretically, short-term household expectations, that's like 1 year expectations, they matter for wage negotiations as well as for labor supply. Although the empirical link, there's not much literature establishing that empirical link yet. There was some FRB letter last year by Sylvain and others that basically says that 1 year household expectations predict wage inflation, but there's not a lot of empirical work on that yet. But theoretically, those are the ones that matter for wage supply rather than longer term inflation expectations of households. And then there's also literature that shows that household inflation expectations, they share some characteristics with firm expectations, especially those of smaller and medium enterprises. And firm expectations are the ones that inform investment hiring and price setting decisions of firms. So presumably household expectations can be used as a proxy for firm expectations as well. And also, while the literature has shown that median household expectations tend to have less predictive power than the expectations of other agents, recently the literature has started focusing more on the changes in the entire distribution of household expectations. And it's arguing that these changes in the distributions can provide important signals. Ricardo Rey's 2021 paper, for example, and his subsequent work really puts the focus on how the changes in distribution of household expectation, how it was basically showed that in US, the anchor of inflation expectations started drifting in 60s, much earlier than the Fed started focusing on that loss of anchor. And then the other two papers are from the fund, of course, and they both look at the distribution of household expectations. And they, one of them, the Meeks and Monty paper, looks at the Phillips curve, and they ask, they show basically that some of these distributional characteristics are important in explaining the surge in inflation in the last couple of years. So what we do in this paper then is to focus really on the distribution of household inflation expectation. And we do two things. First, we document the recent developments in the distribution of one-year household expectations in 4 countries, in US, UK, Germany, and Canada. Now, for US, UK, and also for Germany, the micro data on household expectations is available online. For Germany, it was not available online when we started working on it. We were using Bundesbank data that Bundesbank provided to us. But now, since September last year, ECB also has started publishing the micro data on household expectations. So, we now use the ECB's data, but all of our results are like robust, whichever data set you use, with some differences quantitatively, but not qualitatively. And for Canada, the micro data isn't available online. So Bank of Canada, which also happens to be a former employer, kindly provided us with the data to do this analysis. And then this part of the paper is more descriptive. Then in the second part of the paper, we look econometrically at whether the distributional characteristics of household expectations contain information about future inflation for US, where we have a longer time series available of household distribution going back to 1978. So we're just basically doing a simple forecasting exercise and asking, okay, do the shifts in the distribution of household expectations, are they informative about inflation a year from now? And the two main results of the paper are, first, that the distribution of one-year expectations is rightward significantly everywhere, with more and more households expecting high inflation outcomes. Now, of course, in 2023, there's a little bit of shift back, but they still remain, right of where they were before COVID. And then the second main result is that the shape of the distribution of household expectations does have informational content for 1 year ahead CPI inflation, even after you account for inflation expectations of professional forecasters and of market expectations. Okay, so this graph basically looks at the distribution of near-term inflation expectations for the 4 countries. And the dotted blue lines, those are the pre-COVID or as close as we could find to pre-COVID distributions. And for all of those 4 countries, you see basically that the median, which is a black dot, it was close to the 2% line or target. And the distribution was a little bit more symmetric than it is now. So the black line looks at the April 2022 or spring Q2 2022 distribution, and the orange lines are the most recent data that's available. And what we see is really an important shift rightward in all of these 4 countries, maybe in Canada less than the others, but certainly in US, Germany, and UK. Now, if you look at the Bundesbank data for Germany, the shift looks even more profound than it looks in the ECB data set. But then in Germany, for the Bundesbank data, you also start from a higher median expectation of household.
Can I ask one thing about the
Yeah.
Wait, well, because I see that you have this wavy behavior. Did you smooth the distribution?
Yeah, that's a bit of a smoothing issue.
Because usually what you find is people concentrating around 10, 15, and 20. And instead you have this concept is the higher percentage of people answering between the two. So this might be due to the smoothing. Where I would expect higher percentage of people. It's
yeah, so we use essentially, these are kernel fits, right? And what we did was we used the raise method as is. So what he does is basically takes all of the, these are point forecasts, right? All of the forecasts between a certain bucket and puts them in the middle of the bucket, and then you put the kernel density on that, and that's why they look a bit bumpy. I mean, of course, if you use a higher smoothing parameter, we can smooth it out, but
besides bumpy, the problem is that when you go to the raw data, you will see that you have a high percentage of people answering 10, 15, 20, and in your smoothing, this disappears. This is a feature that you may want to keep into the distribution. There is a literature explaining why people that is not sure about what kind of rate has to concentrate around.
Maybe key questions, besides clarifying questions to the end, please. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
sorry, if you go to the data, you find that a high percentage of people have like at 5 or 15%, and when you smooth it, yeah, but it doesn't, like, for our purposes, that's not affecting the results, right? Because what we are measuring in the end in the econometric exercise is the skewness and the variance, and that doesn't change really, you know. And the other thing that this does is also, so we are taking actually for the US, when we do the econometrics, we are taking what the Michigan, University of Michigan publishes, the bucketed data that they publish, right? And so we are just taking that as it, and then they clean it out with all the extreme observations that people have, or 50% or more inflation and all that, and then they also assign the don't knows, so that the medians are consistent with the I think it's the other characteristics of the data that they compile, right? Now, if you just look at the, say, the percentiles of the original distribution, the microdata, and if you look at the percentiles of the bin distribution, so essentially what we are keeping by the, we can call it Münsterizing at the end, something between first to 90th percentile of the distributions, right? So after that, it's more like people assuming 50% or something, populations of very long taper tails, but we are essentially assuming that they are all predicting. So we're not throwing the data out, we are just assuming they're all predicting, I don't know, it's 17.5% is the max, at the midpoint of the last bucket. That's very good. Yeah, I know, I mean, if you look at the distribution, you can ask, oh, but the data peaks there and there, but the question is, does it affect the result? And I don't think it does. It's really great. Okay, so here is where I was showing you the distributions of what they look like since COVID, and then we looked also at what happened in the 70s, 80s episode, right? Whether you see similar shifts happening in late 70s, early 80s. So the data starts only in 78. So here we plot in the blue line the distribution as of 78, which has always accepted, you know, the inflation had already been high for a while by then. And then you have this black line, which is the 1980, and then 1981, and then 1983 is this orange line. So what you see from 1978 is that the distribution shifted significantly to the right, and basically what happens is the skewness becomes negative, right? So you have all of the mass of the distribution shifting to the right, and then it becomes positive again as the distribution shifts back after 1980. So what you see that here as well, where skewness essentially declines until 1980 and then rises. And what happens to the variance of the distribution is that the variance is increasing. Variance is just disagreement, right? So it can be disagreement about increasing inflation or falling inflation. And you see the disagreement increasing all the way until actually inflation peaks, and then it drops, but not so much. It still stays a little bit elevated until, something like 1983, and then it stabilizes. So you have until inflation stabilizes, the variance doesn't stabilize, essentially. So then we asked, okay, what does US data, what do the US moments look like now, given that we are seeing similar distributional shift in the US now? And you see that also that, again, the skewness declines, right? So starting from 2019 here, there's a decline in skewness as the right tail thickens and left one thins out a little bit compared to before. And what you see here is also a decline in skewness right after 2021, while inflation, the variance increases as inflation increases. And now again, inflation has started coming down, but the variance, the disagreement is still elevated, right? And my expectation is that once inflation stabilizes, then that's when invariance will really start to come down. So this gives us some sense of what we can expect, when we look at the data in the forecasting model. And just to be sure that this is not like normal, like these shifts in distributions, you don't see that in normal times. So here's looking at 2 periods of lower stable or falling inflation, and what you see is that between 1996 to 2000, basically very little shifts in distribution, and also between 2012 and 2015. So all of these basically give us some sense of what to expect when we use in the second part of the paper a simple forecasting model, and where we use the monthly US data from January 1978 to actually it's not to October 22 at all. It's now until 2023, the latest. I think it's April. We basically just predicting 1 year ahead CPI inflation using the vector of different characteristics of distribution of 1 year ahead household inflation expectations as of today. So we're predicting 1 year ahead inflation based on inflation expectations today, and today's inflation. And we used various measures in the to capture the distribution. We use actually again this needs updating. We now use a median and the variance in skewness of the household distribution. And as a robustness check, we also use the first 4 functional principal components. So FPCA is a methodology that basically allows you to describe the distribution in 3 or 4 functional principal comments. It's like PCA, but for functions instead of variables. And we use that to capture the distribution of household expectations as well. And then we ask whether these betas associated with the household expectation distributions are significant. And then we also do a horse race with professional and market forecasters. And so we add to the above regression the median consensus forecast and market rates, inflation expectation, and also the higher moments of the consensus forecast as well. And then we have a bunch of other business checks that I'll describe later. So the first result then is that the shape of the distribution of household expectations, it contains information about future CPI inflation. So the first set of results is the full sample, and you see the median as well as the variance in the skewness being significant. And for the median, and also a decent adjusted R-square. And for the median, you basically see higher median index, higher inflation. For skewness, as expected, and as I described in the graphical slides, that a higher skewness, more positive skewness predicts lower inflation, and a more negative skewness, so the mask of the distribution shifted to the right predicts a higher inflation a year ahead. And for variance, again, you have a negative sign here now, which is a little bit messy, but it's not very inconsistent with what we saw, where variance being disagreement stays up even after inflation starts declining. But it's also true that there are a number of potential structural shifts in the entire sample with the 78 to 80s, this inflation period, and then you have the great moderation with basically a trending down inflation, and then you have the current period of recent surge in inflation. So what we did was also to look at different, we looked at structural rates used to global breakpoint test to estimate structural rates, and we found that basically 4 subsamples. So the first one, which is the high inflation period, and also the last high inflation period, you basically get a high adjusted R-squares. And then in the middle one, you have very little forecasting power of the equation. And then again, in the first subsample, which is basically after 1980, inflation started declining and variance stayed up, so you have this negative sign here. But in the very recent sample, you see variance coming in with the positive sign. So higher variance is maybe predicting higher inflation. And so instead of doing sample breaks, this is another way of doing the same thing. So we interact the moments of the distribution with trend inflation, where we measure the trend inflation as previous 12 months or 18 months average inflation, and you essentially get in terms of interpretation very similar results. That median predicts higher inflation when the inflation is trending up, and higher variance predicts higher inflation, except but the coefficients the interaction term is negative. So what that means is that at some point at very high inflation levels, you have you potentially have a negative overall effect of variance on inflation. So inflation trends down, starts trending down, the variance stays up. So then looking at what does this mean for the forecast, right? So the actual inflation, the average actual inflation since April 2021 is something like 7%. And, in a model which just uses the 1% and lagged inflation, you get a certain average inflation forecast and a higher one if you add the median of the distribution to the model, a little bit further higher one if you add the variance as well, and not much difference between that and the model of the skewness. So basically just say that if you looked at the distribution of household expectations, you would have been closer to predicting the high inflation that followed than if you didn't look at that. Okay. And then this is the horse race slide, and I'm just going to close very soon. So this is basically just very quickly saying that these household distribution just stay significant even after we add not just the medians of the professional forecasts, but also the variance and skewness of those forecasts, and also the market rates forecasts. Okay. So a bunch of robustness checks, including the RPCA to capture the distribution. We use additional lags of inflation as well as additional controls like unemployment or capacity utilization, like Stock and Watson did. And then we also looked at, instead of forecasting a year ahead of inflation, we forecasted 6 months ahead of inflation, exactly the same results. And then we are working now on all sample performance as well as a mixed distribution model, which basically tries to say, okay, why are the distributions shifting? Is it because there's more informed and less informed people, and then there's one group that changes the expectations soon, and then what you see in the final distribution is really a combination of the expectations of the two more informed and less informed group. That might also explain, what the results you get for the variance and so on. So that's the next step. We will put it out as a working paper. Okay, so the key takeaways, first that distribution of household inflation expectations contain important information about future inflation. So it's useful to complement, implied inflation measures and expectations of professional forecast with household expectation and their distributions. Second, that since the pandemic, near-term household expectations shifted by the goal of the advanced economy study, and that these shifts may have significant resistance to inflation in the whole period ahead, and that advanced economies and domains should rely on these shifts in expectation that they decide.
We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
That's a quick question just to double check if I got the message. So this skewness that you have, this tail to the right. So I mean you get it the first part of your sample, right? But then it corrects in the grade moderation.
Yeah, it's correct. Yeah.
And then you get it back
Yeah.
in the last sample, right?
So, I mean, the distribution is always a little bit positively skewed, even in like the grade moderation periods. I think that's quite standard. But what happens then is that it becomes during high inflation periods, it becomes more well, the students denies inflation. And then if you look at this one, it becomes actually negative because you see in the background we had a price part.
Thank you.
I remember from your table when you looked at these subsamples that the sign of the effect of variance on the forecast changed, right? It was negative. So
Yeah.
isn't that a reason to worry that you're just picking up noise? Say in the 70s, there was a lot of uncertainties, and then inflation came down now in that recent episode. We had a lot of uncertainty, and then inflation crept up. So you're picking up this, but there's really no systematic relationship.
Yeah, I mean, variance, we didn't have a very strong prior to what the sign should be, right? Because variance is a disagreement. So it can be disagreement about rising inflation and it can be disagreement about falling inflation. And you're right. And that's why we're looking at the mixed distribution model to try to understand like what is really going on, because it's our concern is that the sign is changing over sample there. And also like what should the sign be? Like it's not really clear to us anyway. Exactly. So that's why we're trying to like have some kind of underlying, a model that help us have better prior, and then also, to say that okay, we should use this in the forecasting model because this is what you should expect. Yeah.
So I just remember from Nassim Taleb's discussion of it in the Black Swan that these higher moment conditions were often driven by just a few observations. And so I'm wondering if the new US standard errors are really the right way to go here, and it might be better to do like a jackknife or something like that to understand how much the skewness and maybe even the variance are being driven by the most extreme observations rather than
Yeah, so actually this is one of the reasons for using the bin data rather than just the raw data. So we have, I mean, if you look at it, basically the distribution ends at -5 and 20, right? It's because all of those.
Yeah, but 20 is really far away, right?
Huh?
20 is really far away from 2.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Many households have
Yeah.
very far away expectations.
Well, right, but maybe those expectations are useless. I don't know.
So we are going to do like robustness tests using the moments of the full distribution rather than the main data. And then that is a nice suggestion. We'll try that as well. Let's see what
Censoring those kinds of data is normal for what you've done, and it's okay. In general, it's always faster. You never use really the extreme during critical analysis. Perhaps you want to test whether the censoring part that you use is the correct one.
I can't catch. I don't agree with what you're saying.
So basically, not censoring. You visualize the sample. That's what you do. Perhaps you want to test that visualization point you take is correct. So try a few more visualization. We have at ECB, we do the 2%. Lower and upper bound. I don't know what you have applied here. You say that I couldn't catch. Perhaps you want to try different visualization.
You have to present as the upper bound of the inflation target, right? Yeah.
No. What I'm saying is in the consumer expectation carving, when we have an expectation about inflation, we always visualize the distribution at the lowest 2%, highest 2%. By the way, if you do the same exercise, you can repeat this kind of analysis. Visualizing the 2.3%.
Yeah. So this one has like buckets of 5 percentage points, and then all of the mass is then at the center of the bucket. And I think so. It's It's not been surmised in the sense that you throw out observations after 20, but it's basically you take all that of the frequency and put it inside the last one.
This is with rotation. Censoring is throwing away. With rotation, it can be assigned. That's what we do.
Unfortunately, we have to keep this very interesting discussion with the coffee break. Now, but Rolano's telling us about inflation. Thank you.
Work with a number of authors, Hassan, Afrouzi, Dietrich, Gernot, Müller, Kristian, Myrseth, and Raphael Schoenle. Some are in this room, others are in parallel sessions. Maybe for you to talk to them in silence if you like. I guess here. So this is very much work in progress. So any comments you may have are very much appreciated. So let me start by motivating this paper with putting on this slide, which speaks about the mandate of the Federal Reserve. So the mandate of central bank in the US and in other jurisdictions is given by Congress for Parliament. And in particular, in the case of the US, Congress told the Federal Reserve that we have to care about, the so-called dual mandate, some kind of notion of price stability, and some kind of notion of employment stabilization. And then there are also some other considerations. Now, in the case of the US, this definition of price stability is at the discretion of the Fed. And the Fed came to the conclusion that the rate of inflation that it wants to target is a level of 2% on average per year over in the long term. Okay. So the natural question which arises after showing this mandate is whether this 2% target inflation is in fact desirable from the perspective of agents in the economy. So there are normative theories out there in the literature which speak about different advantages or disadvantages of inflation, and they speak about different levels of optimal inflation. For example, there's this notion that to safeguard monetary policy from hitting the effective lower bound, it's good to have some sort of inflation. There's this other notion by Friedman in 1969, which says, given that cash is an instrument which provides no interest, it's optimal to keep the nominal interest rates at zero, and whatever the real interest rate is, then we have optimal deflation. So, there are different considerations out there in the theory. In practice, there's very little evidence which has gone out, and surveyed people about what they actually prefer to be the rate of inflation in the economy, with the exception of these papers over here. So there's this paper by Ski, for example, 2004, which surveys consumers in advanced economies, and indeed consumers dislike inflation, dislike unemployment, and so on and so on. So this is where we come in with our paper, and we try to provide a micro-level empirical approach to elicit actual consumer preferences on the optimal long-term rate of inflation, and as an extension, on how consumers might want to resolve this trade-off between price stability on the one hand and unemployment stabilization on the other. So, in doing so, we document heterogeneity in these preferences. So the drivers of these preferences are related to characteristics, demographic characteristics, age, and so on and so forth. And second, then that's the question, so why do consumers want this level of inflation that we find in the data? What kind of mental model do they have, or are they forming when they respond in the way that they respond in our survey? Again, this relates to this paper by Andrea and authors from the restart, where effectively they provide different kinds of models of economic mechanisms to respondents in the survey, and they are able to understand what kind of economic reasoning respondents have when they assess macroeconomic shocks in their hypothetical or artificial economy. So let me just preview a bit the main findings. So we find in our survey that respondents prefer a negative inflation rate per annum, and this number is in order of magnitude minus 3.72%. Then with respect to the unemployment and inflation trade-off, the respondents in our survey indicate on average that they prefer, they attach a higher weight on inflation stabilization, and this weight on inflation stabilization relative to unemployment is 1.4, which effectively means it's less hawkish than let's say standard prescriptions of other types of variables prescribed. And then we find that, so this is the average result, but clearly there is also heterogeneity in these preferences. and which are driven by a number of considerations. So there are certain groups in the economy which tolerate somewhat higher inflation, and those are the young, the high income, the highly educated. They prefer a 0% inflation rate per year. And then with respect to the trade-off, some also attach a lower weight in inflation relative to the average number. And finally, when we test or when we see what kind of models for economic reasoning these agents have in answering this question about their inflation preference, we find that a lot of these different types of models are relevant for their considerations. And as a second step, when we treat them and we tell them, look at this notion, now you want to revise your inflation preference, in some cases, maybe meaning that economic policy here has some role, or there are gains to be had from communicating policy with respect to central banks in moving inflation preferences for agents. Okay. So now we go into some details. So this is an online survey conducted by Qualtrics. The sample size is 1,000 respondents, and it was implemented in November 2023 of last year. It's nationally represented in the US, according to the dimensions over here, and then there are standard weightings to adjust for sampling accuracy. What do we measure? As I said, what we care about measuring is the long run per year inflation preference at the aggregate level. So I denote here by P90 star. So this is the economy-wide inflation of agents one. And second, we have the inflation referring to their personal spending. So assuming, let's say, that the individual consumption basket is different to, let's say, the basket used by the authorities to construct their measure of aggregate inflation, this is the PID star. We also asked them about what is their perceived target, the perceived long-term level target by the Federal Reserve, PID. And we asked them what is their preferred weight on stabilizing inflation relative to the unemployment. And this is a number bound below by 0, bound above by 100. Okay. And as I said, in a follow-up second wave of the survey, we asked these respondents about what are their mental models, what are their economic theories for forming such preferences online. So here, let me put up the question which we asked, the first question. So the question goes as follows: consider all the goods and services that you, if you refer to personal spending, or the typical US households, when we refer to aggregate inflation, consumes. How would you prefer that these prices of these goods and services change in a typical year? And here respondents have to select between these three options: do they increase, stay the same, do they decrease. And after this Q1 comes question Q2, and depending on their answer, we ask them in a typical year by how much would you prefer that these prices change. And they're asked to select one of these stages over here. Okay. And here are the results on average across the survey by not conditional and anything, unconditional results. So on the left here, we have in the red dot the median response of all the respondents in our sample for the aggregate inflation question. So where's the aggregate inflation rate in that you prefer in a typical year? And here it's for the individual inflation rates, so for the basket of goods that you're consuming. And these black lines are the dispersion of all the different responses. So as you can clearly see, those numbers are negative, they're below 0. And they're statistically different from 0, right? And the median response for aggregate inflation is minus 0.72%. On the right-hand side, we have the question related to the target of the Fed. And what we see is that almost all respondents believe that the Fed is targeting an inflation rate, which is somewhere close to 4%. So their inflation preference is going to be much lower than their perceived target of the Fed Reserve. Now let's start to dig a bit deeper and to condition the sample on different characteristics, economic characteristics. So on the left, we have age. So different colors are different groups. And on the right, we have gender, different colors are different genders. And what we can see here is that for the young, the red bars over there, they prefer somewhat higher inflation relative to the average respondent and relative to the middle-aged and relative to the older. And this higher inflation, however, is going to be not statistically different from 0. So it's not positive inflation, it's not inflation, it's somewhere else. And similar apply, similar result for males relative to females. And if we do another split related to income, so low, medium, high income, and here on the right related to education, so low education and high educated individuals, we again find some heterogeneity and some variation in these preferences. And the result is that there's a higher inflation preference for the higher income individuals, the green here, and also for the more educated individuals, the green over here. Okay. And again, on average, it's not going to be statistically different for these subgroups. So let me summarize a bit this first set of results. So we have unconditionally, agents prefer deflation. There is substantial variation, which is driven by different socioeconomic characteristics. And we can probably conjecture that these socioeconomic characteristics capture some kind of wealth as being a potential underlying mechanism. So the older might have a higher inflation preference, as do the more educated, as do the richer. So, there are papers out there, papers by Gurnain and Volkers, probably R&R Revista, which says that, optimal monetary policy has to be more hawkish against the wealthier part of the population. So perhaps this is one possible explanation for this heterogeneity in preference to be observed. Now, clearly, it's not going to be only socioeconomic characteristics which drive this. So this brings us to the second set of the survey. And we ask the question, okay, what else could be driving this? So we complement this first survey with the second way of the survey with an online experiment using Propagation. And what we do here is we start by eliciting the prior of these respondents. What is your inflation preference? Then we treat them with some kind of information about, we offer them a menu of different types of inflation models. So arguments for inflation, arguments against inflation. And then we ask them again, we take their posterior, whether they have updated their response relative to their original answer following the information provided in this treatment. And what are these treatments? So there are 6 particular treatments that we focus on. I won't go through all of them for the sake of brevity. Just look at the ones in bold, as those are going to be the ones that are significant in moving the prior and the posterior relative to the prior. Is this notion by Friedman, that cash pays no interest, so it's good to have some deflation. It's the notion of this effect lower bound. It's good to have some inflation perspective from the effect lower bound. Then there is this notion of greasing the wheels of the labor market. So, sometimes it's good to cut wages, maximize employment. We can do that instead by having inflation. And finally, there is this notion of the price comparison. So it's good to have stable prices because we compare products which are similar in nature. So those are the different types of treatments, and different respondents get one of these different types of treatments. Now, there's also a control group in this set. This control group doesn't get any of these treatments, but rather after responding to their question on what is your preferred rate of inflation, we ask them a question of which of these considerations apply to you. Are they relevant for your for forming, let's say, or for answering the question on your optimal rate of inflation the way you have? And clearly what we can see here is that a large share of respondents have highlighted that 3 or 4 of these particular notions or theories are relevant consideration. But in particular, 72% say that the Friedman argument relates to them. 91% say that this idea of price comparison relates to them, and 90% speak about. So these are 2 additional notions which we in the control group. Something to say about impact independence, and something to say about the conflict of inflation, meaning that workers want higher wages, firms want higher prices. There's a bargaining game going on. That is inflation, and 90% of those respondents say that they relate to this. Okay, so the idea here that you should take home from this, the message here is that when agents form their preferences for inflation, they think about different types of models, and those are the types of models that they care about. Now, when we regress the posterior against these against these considerations, we find that the relevance to these theories explains almost 14% of this variation in preferences, which unconditionally speak about inflation. Now, also, when we look at the correlation between the Friedman rule and the inflation preference, we find that this correlation is negative, meaning that if someone cares about the Friedman rule, that person is going to have somewhat lower inflation preference than someone who says they don't care about the Friedman rule. And conversely, someone who says that they care about this notion of residual goods of the labor market, they're going to have a somewhat higher inflation preference with someone who says they don't. Okay. Now let's look at the treatment group. So the treatment group here, these are a number of regressions. On the first column, clearly we have a correlation between the posterior and the prior. In the middle column, there is a correlation between the posterior and the Friedman rule. So again, someone who is treated with information on this Friedman argument is going to have a lower inflation preference. And on the right column, when we change the dependent variable, rather than just the posterior, but rather the difference between the right and posterior, we see that someone who is treated with information on the EOD is going to have a somewhat higher inflation preference. So overall, the message from this analysis is clearly treatments with different types of models effectively are communication tools for central banks, and they can be used to move inflation preferences of different types of agents and potentially to realign them with their own targets. Now, finally, 3 more slides, and then we'll talk about a bit about this in unemployment inflation trade-off. So I said in the beginning, it's not only the level of inflation with agents that we care about here, it's also how they resolve this trade-off with unemployment inflation. So here we're asking this question, please assign weights to these 2 objectives. What do you prefer? And these weights have to sum up to 100, right? In doing so, on average, the average respondent is going to put a weight of 57% on inflation and a weight of 52% on unemployment. And if we dig deeper in it and we look at different types of decompositions in our sample, there's also going to be some variation there. So again, the young individuals, the low-income individuals, the less educated individuals, and the female individuals are going to have somewhere lower weight than relative to the average respondent. And finally, so now let's try to think of, so far we've been quite model agnostic, right? We have several different types of theories. We haven't really, said that this is the theory we want to believe in. So we're being quite flexible in how we rationalize this. Now let's assume that the world can be summarized through the lens of a new Keynesian environment, standard regimes, and so forth. Now in that world, if you look at the optimal policy, so if you take the loss function of the social planner, you look at the monetary policy, and you calibrate this model in a conventional manner, you are going to get that the weight on the inflation objective is going to be much, much higher than the weight on the real activity objective. So 5 versus 4. Okay. Now we calibrate the same model in the same way, but rather if we feed our data into it, what we're going to get from based on our survey is that these weights are going to be substantially different. Okay, this is under the assumption that this is the world that the respondents in our model in the data also be the new Keynesian environment. So what does it tell us? Okay, optimal policy in the new Keynesian environment is going to be much more hawkish relative to our data. And finally, it's not going to capture all this type of heterogeneity, which we have been documenting as well in the data. In particular, what we find, at least, or what our data suggests, is that inflation stabilization has to be more hawkish. It's optimal for it to be more hawkish for the high income and older respondents, and it's optimal for it to be more dovish for the lower income respondents. Okay. And with this, we conclude. So just to wrap up, so we have a survey. We find that consumers prefer deflation on average. We find there is substantial variation in preferences, which are driven by socioeconomic characteristics, and which is also driven by different mental models of inflation. Treating individuals with these different types of economic theories is a possible communication tool by central banks to alter people's inflation preferences. And if we believe the new Keynesian model is a model with a good reflection of reality, then data 30 days consumes on more dollars. So thanks very much for your time.
Time for a couple of questions.
Question?
Let's maybe give that we fix that up, maybe for next 3 questions, and then you can combine those answers, and then a second one.
Yeah, so my first question, so for question 1, so which inflation you prefer? The question was this one, or the question was prices declining, do you prefer prices, which better of prices?
Second question.
I was wondering if you ask again the question on inflation rate after the inflation unemployment rate off. In other words, do you think that your survey respondents understand the inflation unemployment rate off?
And third question over here.
I have a question about, it's more about the preference of the policymaker. So if we do a similar approach for the policymakers, I mean, multiple economics or analysts in these institutions and say, how do you think about the 2% target and 30% target? Will the 2% or 30% become a manual model for these policymakers? And how, if this is a proper research question to pursue, what is the suggestion to implement these risk questions following this research approach?
Okay. So let me just say the co-authors are here, and please one right behind you, so you can ask them. So but feel free, Gernot, Raphael, and anyone else to jump in. Okay, so regarding the first question, does this answer your question?
Yeah, so my point is that, so probably if you ask it, what is the inflation rate that you prefer? Probably the answer would be different, but this question, which is fine, I'm not saying that it's not fine. It's just that probably making these questions relevant ones.
Sure. Design this will matter. I presume most. I mean, I don't know anything which way you could buy it or is, but it's a good suggestion that perhaps in the second survey, might directly the inflation question without this sequence.
Maybe this question is more relevant, but probably rarely ask it in this way. If you prefer prices to decline, probably consumers will want to say yes.
That's probably true. I agree with that. But however, I would not see this question in isolation. I would see this question in conjunction with all the analysis we've done, and in particular, I think the main result here that we should focus on is the fact that even though people say that they want to prefer prices to decline, if you offer them some kind of notion or some kind of information about the benefits of inflation, they're going to revise it.
I think if I can add, I think that's really important. Otherwise, it's something about this question.
No, but I think it's a good point. So maybe when people talk about inflation, sometimes it is abstract. But in inflation is bad, but really, I feel also abstract.
Yeah, that's the whole issue. Like, inflation is already a quantitative rate. You sort of framing people that side, you agree. It's sort of first exploration, and I found it really amazing that the theories they come out later and actually seem very reasonable. So not just they have some kind of model or models in mind. I see. Oh yeah, this is a very sensitive thing.
My memory is really bad. I don't remember the other questions.
No, similar. I was asking how many of your responses you think understand the trade-off between inflation and
That's a good question. And I don't know. I think we asked the question, or we at least we plan to ask, their level of financial literacy to be able at least to have some kind of idea of how to think about this.
If time maybe for 3 questions, like if 1, 2, and 3, then maybe.
So my question is, once you have Q1 and if they reply status they are attributed 0 or they will still reply Q2. Because usually when the first question is formulated as such, you always get the kind of how you show people picking the 0 compared to when you leave them free to select their rate. And also, how do you square the fact that in the first part, their preferences go towards the negative inflation rate. In the second part, instead, they have less. So in the weighted function, they are more in favor. They have a higher weights on content. So meaning that they should be less hawkish, meaning that it's a higher inflation rate. But in the first part, is negative, so very hawkish. I don't know if I had this correctly, but
Right, I guess what the
Question?
No, again, well, there's, I'm puzzled how you might be incorporating the substitution bias of a CPI in measure inflation vis-a-vis what they are actually responding, no? Because, I mean, these guys are saying, well, I mean, particularly a group, they are saying, I'd rather have zero inflation, no? But they are not thinking about the CPI, they are thinking about felt inflation. And they are telling you zero, no? And it's funny because, I mean, when you ask them about the level of inflation that the Fed pursues, they tell you 4%, which is, you know, 2% plus. I mean, the Boston Commission, if I remember correctly, is 2%, no? The substitution bias plus something. I mean, how do you conciliate like the measure issues with whatever they release to you? You know what I mean?
Last question.
Okay. Thank you. So do I understand correctly? You only asked them about prices, not about wages.
Yeah.
There's no connection to wages. So the reason why one interpretation is that they like falling prices because that means increasing real wages.
Yeah.
That's
Correct. And in fact, that's one of the information that's you from the other side. That's correct. Yeah. So this is a big or more general issue about parking versus general kind of issues and whether they're agents versus standards. To my knowledge, I can know if there's a way in science where we can capture all the general. No problem. But okay, thanks for all your comments. We can discuss after.
Okay, perfect. So now half an hour, 25 minutes to the max for the presentation. Okay, well, thank you very much. The two-region view of inflation. So this is joint work with pretty much VAS colleagues, Claudio Borio, Marques, and Egon. I'm very grateful for the conference for having this paper on it. It was a pretty late edition. I'm also grateful for my colleague Marco, who submitted the paper and then couldn't attend. So I think Marco was definitely with this. But anyway, I don't know where he is now. He's obviously not here, and I'm happy to be here. Okay, so the two-region view of inflation is something that we've been thinking about in the BIS for a little while. And so some of the analysis here actually started, it came out in our annual economic report, which is just over a year old. And it's sort of it's continued to be part of our thinking about what's going on with inflation at the BIS. So we're trying to think about why did inflation go up? Why is it staying up? What's different now than was in the past? And relates to that, central banks were surprised when inflation increased and stayed up. And so this is sort of a set of empirical evidence to try and explain all those things. All right. So I'm going to go through not everything that's in the underlying paper, but a bunch of empirical results to try and persuade you by the end that thinking about inflation as having two regimes is a good starting point for thinking about where we're at today. And also it might help us think about why we got it wrong. I mean, just sort of to jump ahead to some later stuff. So think about a typical model of inflation, right? Think of a Phillips curve dropping out, linearizing around a steady state. As soon as you assume a steady state, you're kind of assuming one regime, right? A multiple regime model is going to be quite different. So we sort of think that this view of the world will help to explain some of the policy mistakes and the like. All right. So just to summarize, we're going to view inflation really into two regimes: a low, good, stable inflation regime, and another one, a bad, high, volatile inflation regime. And they're going to be different in that they're both kind of self-stabilizing. So the lower inflation regime, inflation doesn't matter. It might go up, it might go down, but it really doesn't matter for what's going on in the economy. And in the high inflation regime, however, things are going to be fundamentally different. Once we get to the high inflation regime, then it's going to tend to stay. It will bounce around in terms of level, but it will stay at a much higher level than the low regime. And further, we're going to think of self-reinforcing transitions between them. So if in the low regime, inflation starts to creep up, well, then if central banks don't do something about it, then we're going to end up in the high inflation regime. Now, we're going to argue too that monetary policy should be fundamentally different in these two regimes. So we're going to say that in the low inflation regime, inflation basically doesn't matter. If there's an inflation shock on the upside or the downside, it's going to tend to dissipate. It's not going to tend to propagate. It's not going to tend to lead to wage price spirals and the like. So it's going to tend to go away, which would mean in the lower inflation regime, the central bank can relax. If inflation is below the target,
as it was in much of the pre-COVID period, then probably it's not going to lead to a deflationary spiral, which is what we worry about. Instead, it's going to tend to go away on its own. And in fact, if we think about deflationary spirals, which was something authorities talk about a lot in the pre-COVID period, they're actually quite rare. And the pointy case is in the Great Depression. Well, in that case, we had monetary policy that was much tighter than it needed to be. We would argue that deflationary spiral was because monetary policy made a mistake was much too tight. On the other hand, if you're in a low inflation regime and inflation picks up a little bit, again, the authorities don't need to do too much because it's going to tend to go away on its own. All right, it's not going to tend to propagate. I'll show you some empirical evidence for that. However, in the high inflation regime, it's fundamentally a different point in place. The central bank needs to respond forcefully and to get back to the low inflation regime. All right. So first, some sort of, we all know these figures now, but on the left-hand panel, we've got advanced economies and emerging market economies, and the share of these where the inflation rate is exceeded 5% for advanced economies and 7% for EMEs. Now, our data is going to end at the end of 2022. And if you look for advanced economies, inflation is really at 40-year highs, right? For advanced economies, it's at 40-year highs. For EMEs, it's a similar story. It's not quite so extreme. This is the highest level in about 20 years. So this is really, it's a generational thing with inflation being the higher it's been for a long time. Another way of passing the data on the right-hand side, we look at the share of CPI components above 5% across these two economies. And of course, we all know that it's much higher now than it was in the say pre-COVID period, with around 60%.
Just clarifying, so is it like baskets or items within the basket?
Okay. I'm going to say it's components. We're using anywhere between 20 and 100 components for most countries for different exercises. I'm not sure exactly what's in this one.
Okay.
But it's
But I would be surprised how you get the basket, but if it's items.
No, it's sort of sectoral level data. We're basically using sectoral level data, yes. So just to sort of summarize where we're going to go here, we're going to say that in the low inflation regime, what ends up in inflation is largely the product of a bunch of idiosyncratic shocks. There's not a strong common component in what's happening with inflation across the economy. If there's a sectoral shock in one sector, it's going to tend to be transient. We're not going to see much evidence of it spilling over to other sectors. When we think about the relationship between prices and wages, that's also going to be very different. In the low inflation regime, increases in prices don't tend to spill over to wages, and increases in wages don't tend to spill over to prices. And when we think about that in the low inflation regime, inflation doesn't matter very much. For people negotiating wages or setting prices, there are other things that matter a lot more. So for consumers with limited bandwidth, they don't pay attention to headline inflation. They're going to focus on other more idiosyncratic factors that affect their decision making. And that's sort of why we're going to argue that monetary policy can afford to be flexible. In the high inflation regime, it's sort of the opposite of all that. In the high inflation regime, there's a lot of commonality. All these prices tend to start moving together. Now, we're going to see much stronger spillovers from one sector to others in the economy. When we look at wage price impacts, they become much stronger. Prices are more likely to show up in wages, or increase in wages are more likely to show up in prices. So we're more likely to see wage price spirals generating the economy. As we're going to think of inflation here as potentially serving as something of a coordinating device. It's now highly relevant to the decision making of households and of firms. And so then monetary policy needs to act forcefully. All right, so that's where we're trying to get to. Let me just show you some of this empirical evidence. Okay, so here we've got some data for two countries. We have a long history of CPI sectoral data being measured in a consistent way. So on the left-hand side, we've got the US, on the right-hand side, we've got Mexico. Now, the dotted yellow line in each of these cases is headline inflation. These are 15-year moving averages of the inflation rate. And next to that, we've got the first principal component of the sectoral level data for each of these countries. We've got the share of the overall variance that it explains on the right-hand side. Okay, so focus on the US for a minute in the left-hand panel. What we can see is when inflation was relatively high back here, that the first principal component of the sectoral CPI data explained about 60% of the overall variability of the CPI. Okay, now when we come down to this more recent period, when headline inflation was much lower, the first principal component explained a lot less, around 20%. All right. Now the Mexican data is even more stark and indicates something about why regimes might be a good way of thinking about it. So here you can see the inflation rate has come down from a much higher level, but it's come down quite gradually over time. Right. This is again the 15-year moving average segment. Now, back when it was really high, was similar to this was worse in the US, around 80% total variability. It's explained by the first principal component. It stays relatively high even when the average inflation rate got down to 10%. Like in my way of thinking about it, that's still on the high inflation regime. But somewhere before we got down to here, which is around 4%, we're now down to a number much more like the US, where the first principal component doesn't explain very much of the overall variability of the CPI components. All right, now this is my favorite graph in terms of persuasive piece of evidence, at least in my mind. And this is thinking about the variance and covariance between the sectoral data. We've got a whole bunch more countries in the census line, it's not limited to a small number. But here we've got the dotted yellow line, this again headline inflation, and the solid black line is the variance of inflation, right? Now we all know that headline inflation and the variance of inflation are highly correlated, right? That's not news. What's interesting is when we take this inflation and put it into its different components, we can explain the variance of headline inflation as the sum of the variances of all the components of inflation and all the covariances between those components, right? It's a simple exercise to do. Now, we know the variance went up when inflation was high, and it came down as inflation came down. But nearly all of that variation came in terms of the co-movements. That's the blue area here. Very little of it came in terms of the variance of the individual components. When inflation is high, the components of the CPI co-move very strongly. When inflation is low, the covariance of these components shrinks a lot. But the variance of the underlying individual components of the CPI, that doesn't change anywhere near as much as the covariances. That's true for a bunch of countries here, pretty more. All right, so this is not specific to any given country. It's a general phenomenon that there's the co-movements that change a lot when the level of inflation changes. Okay, we do another exercise, kind of like spillovers. So here we're going to estimate a Bayesian bar, and we're going to follow this around the shed. We're going to do generalized and possible spot functions. And then from that, we're going to do a generalized forecast error variance decomposition. So this is going to be a way of distilling how much the spillovers occur from one country to another. And we're going to use US PCE data for this. Now, we're going to present this as a heat map. So we're looking at the spillovers between all the different major sectors of US PCE inflation. All right. These numbers, of course, these colors vary over between the different sectors and over time. And we're going to do it for two subsamples here. Well, we're going to think of this a high inflation period and a low inflation period over here. Okay. Now, some sectors, just by definition, are going to have high correlation, high spillover between them. So here, for example, this darkest color here, that's on food and beverages down to food services. All right. Of course, they're going to be strong. There's going to be strong spillovers. But more generally, if you look at these two tables, it's pretty clear that these are darker red than that. Right? On average, the off-diagonal elements, which is the spillovers, get the diagonal elements. We don't care about spillovers within the sector, we care about spillovers between sectors. The off-diagonal elements in the high inflation period were much darker than in the low inflation period. Now, we can do this exercise for a bunch of different countries and compare the inflation rates. We've got high inflation periods and low inflation periods, and this is sort of a general phenomenon. When inflation was higher, spillovers between sectors are higher. Right? When inflation is lower, they shrink as well. We can do it lots of different ways, different time horizons and the like. We get the same basic scoring. All right. How about prices and wages, the wage price nexus? Well, so one argument we make is that fundamentally sustained inflation must involve wage price variance. I mean, if it didn't, if wages don't spill over to prices or prices don't spill over to wages, either real wages are heading to zero or infinity, right? Similarly, profit margins, they're either going to zero or infinity, right? That's the flip side of that. So clearly, sustained inflation means that prices and wages are interacting with each other. So we look at this in a couple of different ways. One is we look at 4-quarter changes in wages and relate it to 4-quarter changes in lagged prices, controlling what's happening to lagged wages. And we do the flip side, for the changes in prices, controlling for lag price behavior, see how it relates to lag wages. All right. We're also going to control for an estimate of net rate of unemployment and productivity over here and fixed effects and the like. And so we're going to do that on a panel of 14 advanced economies starting in 1971 and use rolling 20-year samples of data. All right. So what do we get? Well, one of these graphs is more impressive than the other, but they're at least giving us the sign of what we've looked at. So we're doing these 20-year rolling samples. On the left-hand side, the less impressive one, that's how much wages respond to past inflation. All right, we've got a box of Mr. Spot to indicate the confidence bands around us. Now, when inflation was low, they were lower than when inflation was high. Right? Although the numbers are not statistically. Thank you, sir. Although the numbers are not statistically significant. On the right-hand side, we do get much more significance here. And that's how sensitive inflation is to past wages. So in the low inflation period here, there's very little relationship. Okay? It's not statistically significantly different from zero from past wages to inflation. Whereas back in the high inflation period, there's much stronger relationship. Now we can go a bit further than that. When we think about prices and wages, they should be related in the long run. So we can do this as a integrating framework and also control for productivity in there as well. So we know that in the long run, there should be a relationship between them. And we're going to show that that relationship was much stronger in the high inflation period than in the lower inflation period. All right, so here's our equations here. We've got our long-run relationship here with wages and prices and productivity. We're going to estimate these, plug out the residuals, the estimated residuals from this, and then plug them into error correction equations down here. We're going to distinguish whether these residuals were positive or negative. So if wages or prices were above their long-run relationship or below, and this is going to turn out to be important. And so then we're going to plug this in and estimate these error correction equations down here. Okay. So what do we get? Okay, so I'm just going to talk through a few of these results here. We'll go from the darkest box to the lightest one that I put on here. So let's start off here. This is for negative residuals. So that's when prices or wages or productivity were below the level implied by the long-run relationship. If we look here, this is the high inflation period. We're looking here at 1995. There's again a panel of a bunch of different countries with a bunch of controls in there. And the coefficients here are all negative. They're sort of economically large and they're highly statistically significant. Okay? So what's that saying? When wages were too low relative to the long-run relationship, they tended to increase much more quickly. But that tended to be closed by wages growing more quickly. Or when prices were too low, the gap tended to be closed by prices growing more quickly. Same for productivity. All right? Now, this box over here is what happened in the high inflation period. It's the low inflation period. So that's after 1995. Well, the coefficients are still all the same, which is kind of encouraging, but they're smaller and they're generally not statistically significant. So in the low inflation period, catch-up happened much more slowly. It still happened with these lower growing variables increasing more quickly, but at a much slower pace. Now, how about when the gap is positive, residuals are positive rather than negative? Well, that's the stop box here. When prices or wages grew faster than the historical trend, well, then we get still a negative coefficient, so it's going the right way, but generally they're not statistically significant and they're very small. Now, what does that tell you? Well, if you think at the current juncture, where a bunch of countries experienced, especially early in the surge in inflation, they experienced real wages falling. All right? So wages are growing less slowly than prices. Well, these results tell you is historically, normally what that would result in is wages will then grow faster to catch up. It's not that price growth slows down to the wage growth. All right? So statistically, normally what we see in the data, whether in this period or in this period, is that when wages get behind prices, which is what we've seen in lots of countries, wages catch up. It's not that prices slow down, which is a bit of a cautionary tale for where we're at right now in a bunch of countries where real wages have tended to fall. But we can present this data in lots of different ways. Is the short-run relationships and at the high inflation period, numbers are large and significant, and the lower inflation period, they're smaller and less significant. But another way is in terms of half-lives. So how long does it take for this gap to half go away? How much time did it take? And generally, in the low inflation period, the half-life was only about 2/3 of what it was. Sorry, the high inflation period was about 2/3 of what it was in the low inflation period. So the half-life of these gaps is much longer as inflation's got lower. All right. Okay. So where do we stand now? A bunch of these results are sort of based on rolling samples. They're not too good for picking out where we are right now. Are we in the high inflation regime or are we in the low inflation regime? Or is it, I mean, the low inflation regime wasn't threatening or we really lost the fight, all right? We do a bit of work thinking about what we could do in a more contemporaneous basis. And one is to look at similarity in these micro price changes within the CPI. As inflation increases, price changes become much more similar. This is a simple metric from the paper we have. If we compare the more recent observations, for example, to the end of 2022, it would look similar if we continue today. The most recent observations are the blue dots here, and this box of whiskers is the full sample for the 8 years before COVID. And so the similarity is much, much higher. Now we go a little bit further, and let me just, okay, let's go on to this one. And what we find is the relationship between past inflation and current inflation interact strongly with the degree of similarity. All right. So normally, of course, inflation is a persistent process, but when similarity is high, this coefficient here is going to be highly positive and significant, indicating that past inflation becomes much more linked to past inflation and more persistent. This is our interaction term here. So the fact that prices have become much more similar is indicative of inflation becoming more persistent. We can also measure that more directly. This is inflation persistence in the pre-COVID period versus 2022, and we can do it from different sets of countries. So everything's up and to the left of the 45 green line, showing that persistence has increased. And in fact, that looks a lot like what we do if we take longer periods of time and compare persistence in the low inflation regime versus the high inflation regime for a bunch of countries. Let me see, coming towards the end. All right, let me wrap up. So we think that this view of inflation as two regimes is helpful. We think that a lot of ways we model inflation, basically based around what might implicitly assume a single regime, are going to miss the dynamics of this. We've got some micro data to sort of bear on it. We think it's very helpful and potentially can help to explain why we're where we are today. Of course, there's no fully reliable real-time indicator. In the paper, we have a whole bunch of different discussions about expectations and the like. What else could be a real-time indicator? But there's no magic bullet there. But definitely, are we in the high inflation regime now? Maybe. At the very least, we're in the low inflation regime and high inflation regime. Let me just see. I think we might be got that one a little there. Let me, another thing we looked at was how headline affects core and core affects headline. In the low inflation regime, then headline tends to move towards core. In the high inflation regime, it's the reverse. Right? So there's another sort of piece of evidence that things are fundamentally different. And of course, we know that the effect of big shocks also varies as well. There's some evidence so looking at this. So with oil price shocks, for example, in the low inflation regime, a large oil price shock tends to propagate inflation. Sorry, in the high inflation regime, it tends to propagate inflation. In the low inflation regime, it actually has the opposite effect. But like in the low inflation regime, an oil price shock, well, there's only a limited number of the data, it's as if the effect of that on aggregate demand actually leads to a decline in prices rather than a persistent effect on prices. And I think that's probably where we'll stop there. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Yeah, I very much liked your BIS presentation bulletin number 7, talking about high inflation regimes versus low inflation regimes and how money supply impacted more, in a high inflation regime. I'm concerned now about the transition from a high inflation regime to a low inflation regime. And I would suggest that you do a lot more analysis of the Volcker period and in other countries. How we got transition successfully, perhaps, because we avoided a depression. And exactly what you said is that depressions have a monetary policy much tighter than it should have been. But your fourth suggestion was that monetary policy needs to act forcefully, which sort of is in the opposite direction. We don't want it to act too forcefully for too long. So transition is extremely important.
So this is actually a graph from this. I think it's you guys pulled it in 67. I think this is 60 off the front. But this is the one on the graph from that particular bulletin actually. And so, I mean, Donald Carter mentioned the small and the negative. He sort of agree with this analysis. But here, for example, is excess money growth versus inflation during the recent episode. There's a positive correlation. Perhaps more powerfully is excess money growth and forecast errors on inflation from potential forecasters are also positively correlated. Now, of course, this is one episode, right? I wouldn't want to oversell a correlation between money with anything, but it could be that in a period where the money supply, for whatever reason, increased massively, that it does start to show up in inflation, right? So, but thank you for your broader.
And in the current period, obviously, money supply is down for the first time in 87 years since the Depression.
There is time, so one question is about we showed out how over time in the we have basically the way inflation in a sector is able to trigger inflation in the other sectors. And you show that there was a lot in the past, there is much less currently. I wonder because you can with those analysis, you can also identify which sector is still able to generate more inflation. And I wonder whether compared to the 70s when it was, yes, like you had there, now there is something else like weekly service or something. If you had looked at this dimension, the sector was much in the two methods.
It's a good question for future work. I can't answer that.
And in the empirics, it's two questions probably. In the last part in the empirics, when you have your model with the error correction, can you control for the you do have advanced and emerging economies? Can you control for balance of something effect there for some emerging economies catching up? And what's the impact for them on inflation?
So I think that sample is mainly advanced economy. So we have less of anything with that. I mean, some of this work is a while ago. So I think it's I think it's the same panel as this one here. So it's 14 advanced economies. So if we want to bring emerging market economies, of course, we have to cut all those.
So I think it makes a lot of sense, this kind of view of analyzing the two regimes. And I think it squares well with a couple of theories. In particular, there's this, probably you know, in the 2009 paper by Markowiak and AR on optimal distributed prices within attention, which I think would predict exactly what you're saying about. So I wonder whether you could actually take that. I don't know if you are planning to do something like that, but take that kind of model, calibrate, estimate it with the data, the evidence you presented, and try to say something about the transition within that kind of framework. So I think that could help you with this excellence to understand. I mean, of course, within a structure, with all the pros and cons, but I think that kind of model could actually fit pretty well with this, and we could actually estimate that kind of setup and try to use it to run a couple of kind of factors.
Thank you for the speech.
Any more questions? We have maybe time for one more. If not, then thanks a lot, James. And last but not least.
All right, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting this paper. Thank you for being here, and look forward to the questions that you have. Like I said, very inflation expectations. In 2 days, I was a set of great courses, Benjamin, Nora, and the Sharp, all of us at Frankfurt School. So this is also very much a work in progress. This is also why there's no paper online yet. So there's people working on that, but you see when I present this. As you said, there are a bunch of open, a couple of open things that we're still working on, particularly to the end. But I think I think overall it's a cool topics, so to speak, under the bias, but I think there's a bunch of interesting applications. And so what is the motivation? I think based on the last presentation that we've seen, is relatively clear that basically, as you see, this is the paper for Germany, right? So it's on German inflation, measuring German inflation expectations. So this is why on the left-hand side you see a figure of the consumer price index, how it moved over the last decade or so. And over the last decade, basically, inflation has been relatively low in the period where we've seen a lot of central bank policies, so to speak, quantitative easing in an attempt to actually increase inflation, but nothing happened. And then basically at some point it started shooting up, and it came basically as a surprise to almost everybody. And it raises a bunch of different questions, right? And here's just a few of them. First of all, is actually monetary policy able to still steer inflation expectations, which is probably one where most policymakers are interested in, right? But also others, how to consume it. Right, so how do also how do they change the consumption behavior? And if they do, what does it mean for us? Right, so there's a bunch of interesting applications. So also, if you see here, this is basically everything is happening relatively short term. So how can we actually say something about that, given that, for example, existing measures of inflation expectations based on certain or market data might be not that helpful, given, for example, the low. So this is why the first part of the paper is basically trying to come up with a new way of measuring inflation expectation. And we're using Twitter data. You see just a word cloud with a bunch of these words that are particularly important when it comes to inflation on Twitter. And we think that it basically is complementary to the existing measures that we have. That are usually, if they are based on survey data, relatively small sample, they come with a time delay, which makes it sometimes very difficult, particularly when it comes to market participants to derive some expectations or some conclusions based on that. And that sometimes may be costly to actually obtain, or the market-based inflation expectations measure that actually do not measure consumers' expectations. So what we're trying to do is basically use Twitter to let how people actually talk about inflation and derive some of the sort of how they believe inflation is going to be, or prices are going to be. So what we're doing is, I'm going to talk more about how we do that. We construct an inflation expectation index using tweets of German language tweets using NLP techniques. And what we actually find is that this index that we get is very strongly correlated with actual inflation, but also with survey-based consumer inflation expectations data. It does both in the aggregate, but also if we do this on a regional level, it also holds as well. And then it actually provides an improvement in forecasting accuracy when it comes to inflation expectations as well.
The second bullet point, do you mean that for expectations or for regional inflation?
We're breaking the inflation expectations down on a regional level.
Okay.
Right. So it's
but it doesn't correlate with the realized inflation at the moment.
No, it is.
Because then I would ask you how you get that data.
No, yeah. No, but so I think based on the so we can do this based on the GfK data. So this is actually based on a more local level, but you see basically the results are it's relatively similar across all regions, so we don't really get that much. Right? But the GfK data is going to be what we will. In terms of economics, so we are currently working on two applications which are still work in progress. And where the high frequency nature of our data becomes actually quite handy. One is on monetary policy surprise. So we say that the index decreases after a positive shock, but it's basically linked to policy tightening events. And the second, from my perspective, a little bit more interesting application, so to speak, we're cooperating with a fintech that actually has access to virtually all online consumer baskets, where we can actually see what consumers purchase, what kind of products, quantities, and prices. So basically, 722 million consumer transactions from more than 1,000 German firms. And we currently work on very aggregate level. I'm going to show you the results. But what we show right now, or what we find overall, is that the index is very negatively correlated with the discretionary consumer spending, which you probably might expect. If there's an expected increase in prices, you just adjust. You do not buy what's sort of more discretionary, but you go with buy what's actually necessary. But this is a very preliminary results.
So are you able to link this consumer transactions to the Twitter
No.
So I mean, right now, so we cannot, so we do not know the people, of course, right? So we cannot match the people, right? But we can basically aggregate this and then see whether right now we have the aggregate purchase data, but if we can go on the relatively like transaction by transaction data, we see actually how people do they maybe switch from in the same product category from the more expensive to the cheaper one, from what kind of digital footprint are they accessing, how long do they stay, so we get a lot of information about how the consumers actually. And then we can also derive implications for the So how do we do that? These are the 4 steps that we need to do in order to build this inflation expectation index. You can see from step 1 why we focus on Germany right now, which is a heavily computing intensive exercise, so to speak. So we use the Twitter API, use tweets that are potentially related to inflation based on a bunch of words in German, of course, that we use. From March 2006 to May 2023, we have roughly 11 million tweets from more than 1 million users. And we're constantly revising and updating that methodology. Once we have the index basically set up, we can then implement this very easily to the other European countries, because the messages are basically, doesn't really matter what kind of language it's actually. And I'm going to walk you more through the step 2 to 4. So first of all, we need to do some topic modeling to actually figure out which tweets are really about price and inflation, to remove particularly bot activity, which is effectively some advertising, which is necessary. The third step is we need to classify them, because it doesn't help us only if we talk about it. We want to know if we talk about whether inflation is actually going up or down, or whether it's basically neutral in order to create our index. And then the step 4 is then aggregating this to a twin. So let's talk about the different steps up to now. So the first one is the topic modeling. The left figure is showing you how this works. You need to start at the bottom and then move to the top. On the right hand side, a little bit of the explanation where we sort of deviate from the normal use of these methods, right? So what overall use we use them as a topic modeling thing, kind of called a word topic or word model. This is a called transformer-based language model, and the benefit of such, it's a neural network basically. The benefit of that is not only computationally efficient, but it's basically not only focusing on the words by themselves, but they put the words into context on the sentence in which they're spoken. Right? So it's learning basically based on how the word is used in a sentence. And the most important step is actually this one, in which the machine goes through the tweets and translates into a so-called embedding. Right? So what we need is a very highly trained model that can actually identify the sort of the language that's actually being used.
Where's the location information coming from, and how accurate is it?
The location information, can I talk to that? Can I have this a little bit later? So this is why we, instead of an expert model, we go to one which is called a twinbird. The TW is called for Twitter, because that's not only trained on a lot of different text data, but it's trained on billions of tweets. So it's actually trained on the language that people normally use in tweets. And so basically what we're doing first of all, we create these embeddings using this twinbird model. Then we use a different methodology to reduce dimensionality and cluster those into different topics. Once we have that, we use the tweets that we have, and then just basically not only place them in the individual topic, but we assign weights as to how close they are to the actual topic that we're talking about. Right? Eventually, after this process, we have a number of topics of 150, and then manually select those, bring this down to 19 that actually deal with it. So that is the first step that we do. If we do that, we can structure these 19 or put these 19 topics into 4 general different classes. One is the general inflation topic, which is basically 60% of all our data. One is people talk about energy prices, about inflation and policy, and one which is about housing, right? And if we do a timeline of how and when people talk about that, the horizontal as in vertical is here tweets in a year in thousands, you can see over time what people are actually talking about. Right? So in Germany, apparently housing is not that big of a deal because housing maybe is, or rent might not, or generally not be tied to inflation, for example. Right? In general, the general topics are usually more important, and then starting in 2021, you can see that people focus their and now their tweets on energy as well as inflation policy related. So this is sort of where how these people talk about inflation and the individual aspects over time. But now what we need to do, we need to sort of who's actually talking about rising or decreasing inflation. So in order to do that, we need to classify those. And we want to classify those tweets into 3 groups, up and down, and sort of undecided, so to speak. So we're going to need to train them, right? So we're going to use again this twin-bird model because it's based on these, or it has been trained on tweets, but we need to find, we need to tell them exactly what's actually up, which is down, which is neutral. And instead of manually labeling thousands of tweets ourselves, what we're actually doing is we're using ChatGPT. So we're writing prompts in order to make ChatGPT classify tweets as going up and down or being neutral. So what we then do is we need to then train the model, basically. We have now the labels up, down, and neutral. And now we take 90% of that sample as our training exercise. And basically let the twin-bird model sort of classify itself and see, basically in every step, see how accurately does it classify the tweets into up, down, and neutral. And then afterwards, it basically improves itself over time. Right? And at the end of the day, we end up with about 377,000 up tweets, 88,000 down tweets, and the majority, 830,000 other tweets. And the accuracy is about 76%, which I think is quite okay, even though it's relatively difficult. So this is the third step, and then the last step is to aggregate this to an index. So what we're doing on a daily basis is we're creating this net index up minus down, and that's what we're basically plotting here. So you see here some movement, but relatively little, but you see also there's a negative index here, and then in 2021 it jumps up, and then it comes down in 2020. So this is our index. So the next step, in order to see how good this measure actually is, also in contrast to existing survey-based measures, we're going to compare this to a couple of measures that we obtained from different data sources. I think the first one we already heard in the first presentation. So we get the inflation expectation, the quantitative one from the Bundesbank online panel for households. This is available since April 2020. We get qualitative inflation expectations from the GfK consumer climate indicator for Germany. This is a full sample. This is qualitative. This basically says, are you going to expect an increase or decrease? So we're going to make this a quantitative one by looking at the percentage of the ones who actually say increase.
By now you get also the quantitative one.
Oh, really? Okay. Then we can also update this. And then we have the realized year-on-year consumer price data, the CPI get on the status. And that's what we worked. So the first one, this is a time series now, given this is monthly, so we aggregate our method to a monthly basis. The inflation index that we create is in black. The CPI, the realized one, is in the blue one, and inflation expectation from the Bundesbank starting in 2020 is the what's it called? On the circles. Yeah? But I think the most important message here is it tracks actually the realized inflation expectations quite well. It does actually tracks inflation expectations better likely than the realized one. What you can see, and I think this is an important part, in 2020, when the realized inflation actually was coming down, our inflation expectation measures are actually remaining relatively high. Right? And I think this is one of the key evidence why we're arguing that this is actually measuring expectation rather than anything else.
Yeah, in that case, I wonder whether the official statistic includes the change in the VAT that was in Germany, and of course, people didn't probably pricing that change. So if it's just related to that happens, so it might be policy includes the decoupling between inflation expectation and the official one.
When you classify the tweets in the sense that some show an upward belief in inflation and others show an downward belief,
is it possible to actually identify tweets that actually contain words related to expectations? Because these upward changes can be related to realized inflation, may not be updated future inflation. So in short, we are working on that. So we haven't done this yet. So what we're trying to, it's not that easy to actually. So you need to train the model to actually go into something like in super something like that. So we haven't. So this is one thing, and we haven't done that yet. So that's a short answer. Okay, and the second picture I'm going to show you is where we compare this to the more long run inflation expectation. This is based on the GFK measure. This is in blue, and here again, it appears to be tracking this overall quite nicely. Right? If we do this and calculate correlations between those, and just to make sure that this is not high correlations are not being driven by this jump that we see once now in 2022, we Jesus Christ, calculate correlations for different time periods. So the index ending in 2018, 19, 20, and so on. And you can see here, for example, with in terms of CPI, a relatively high correlation throughout, except in 2020, where we saw this sort of negative correlation between when the index was dropping and how it was not. But here with the GFK measure, constantly high, as well as here with the Bundesbank measure, the same. What we do then is try to investigate whether our measure actually improves the forecasting power of the benchmark model in terms of future inflation expectations, or also realized inflation. The most important one is actually this first, basically the expectation measures, which is basically this one and this one. So the first three rows are the benchmarks model we use in RL1 model to do that. But the third to sixth row here is basically telling us a relative comparison where we include in this benchmark model our inflation expectations in this, right? Which means that the Booth mean square error below 1 would indicate an increase in the forecasting power compared to the benchmark model. And you can see that in most instances here, the H1 to 3 is a month. It's 1 to 3 months ahead. You can see that in most instances, the inflation index that we add actually to the forecasting power, and this is specifically the case in the Bundesbank survey, where it has sort of like lowest. Right, so that is the second result. On the one hand, it does correlate quite nicely, and it also adds to the forecasting power over the next couple of months or quarters. So what we do then is, and this actually speaks a little bit to your question in terms of the regional dispersion, geographic dispersion. So you can look at this actually from two ways. You can either think about where do these people actually live who tweet, or where do they actually tweet from, right? So sometimes you can actually get, I also can see this myself when I tweet yesterday evening, the location was Manhattan, right? So I don't live here, but I tweet. Right? So what we could actually do, I don't have that here, we actually have a tweet that we can track directly to the Müller house in Berlin, with someone in the Bundestag actually was actively tweeting about inflation, for example. Yeah? But this is not what we're focusing. We want to focus actually on the people where they actually live. And you can see here, this is just a visualization of the geographic information that we get from our tweets and the information provided by the consumer. And now, directly to your question, sometimes it's not that easy to actually identify where they are from. And I forgot the name of the model, but we use also machine learning model to actually obtain the geographic information from the tweets. Sometimes they're actually provided in the profile that they're updating. But this is also a little bit of the but this is the way how we do it. And you can see here we have the 4 geographic regions. We have east, north, south, and west. And what you can see, it's relatively similar, right? So you don't, at least out of that, there doesn't seem to be many differences. In the east, the long inflation expectation measure obtained from GFP seem to be higher than in others, but overall, we don't see huge differences in this geographic segments. In the last couple of minutes that I have, let me show you sort of a little bit of the work in progress stuff that we have. On the one hand, the application monetary policy, and the question, can the ECB likely actually still steer inflation expectations? So what we're going to do, we're doing local projections, and this is on the left-hand side, this is a change in our inflation expectation index. So what we need is then a surprise in terms of monetary policy shock. What we use is the Altabilla et al. Measure, so to speak, which is the intraday change in the 2-year overnight index swap rate. Right? If there's an increase, it's a surprise in terms of tightening. If it's decreasing, it's below zero, then it's basically the opposite effect, losing on monetary policy. Right? And then we have a vector of control, including the length of the left-hand side variable, and the beta H gives us the response of the inflation index to this surprise over the horizon of H. So this is, if we do this in for this equation, so this is our beta, so to speak. So if there's this surprise, we first see an increase in the inflation expectation, and then it's basically going down. So the index decreases after surprise monetary tightening. Right. So here we do this. Here we do this separately. So here we actually split this up. The tightening where the shock, the open drive index, always actually going up. Here it's actually going down, and you can see also these data being shown here. So we see that if it's a monetary policy loosening, there's not much going on here. Only if there's a tightening, we see a response in terms of inflation index goes up first and then it goes down, at least over the next days. So this is the first one. The second one is at least the first results in terms of our consumption data. So as I said before, BRIPS is the name of the startup. We're cooperating with more than 1,000 firms starting in 2021. 700 million transactions over different product categories. This is the number of transactions per category. You can see that half of that is coming from apparels, and then there's a distribution for different other categories such as electrics and difficult tools, arts and entertainment, and other ones. Right? On the right-hand side, you can see that the number of transactions per category and how they develop over time. And I think the only takeaway from that is that it is actually responding. Right? Over time, the number of transactions is apparently going down here at a time when we would observe the also changes in our inflation expectation. And the question is then, what is actually decreasing? Is this what we would expect, the discretionary part, or what is actually decreasing? How do consumers change their behavior? So at least from the aggregate data, what we plot is the correlation of our index with the different categories, right? And the more negative, sort of, the more discretionary, sort of. So all of these are discretionary spending. They're negatively correlated. So in situation when it's like consumers expect an increase in inflation, then they reduce the spending on discretionary products. That would be at least an aggregate interpretation. And that is, like, for example, animals and pet supplies, something which is not discretionary because you cannot stop it all. So, so at least this is, as of now, as we have it, as I said, we want to go to the transaction level to see how they actually change their purchase behavior, also which kind of customers do that, richer and poorer based on some of the classifications that we can do, and then actually move also what does it mean for firms, right? So, but this is something which is really sort of work in progress. So just to conclude, and then we can put the Q&A afterwards. So we construct this inflation expectation index using, for Germany now, we're using this NLP. Benefit is high frequency, almost available in real time because it's a bit computationally expensive to do that. It strongly correlates with inflation, realized inflation, as well as the survey-based expectations measures. We do find that it reacts to monetary policy announcements, specifically to the tightening surprises, and it appears to be that a lot of market participants, and I think there might be a bunch of applications, people are interested in that. get uses for real-time, getting real-time information about the patients or the consumers and how they might change their behavior based on it. Okay, now let me stop here and then we'll.
Thank you. We have time for 2-3 questions. Maybe start in the back, then come over here to the front.
So I was thinking in the terms of the discretionary consumer dependent that you're using an e-commerce database, and in this there were also the lockdowns and the easing of the COVID measures. So I was wondering to which extent that can explain when people were buying clothes online in early 2022, they just had to scan your vaccination pass in the shop and so on, and whether you can control or like separate that information.
That's a good one. I take it with me. I think we need to see the more detailed notes, the more detailed data in order to see what's going on. I think this is important.
Twitter recently announced that there's going to be a limit on the number of tweets you can see. So is that going to be a problem? Are you going to hit the upper bound on that? Going forward?
So first of all, I think it's temporary. I honestly haven't checked this yet. I will reply was before. This is the research or academic debate. So I don't know whether this limitation applies to that as well. To be honest, otherwise, yeah. I mean, we
I had one comment concerning the two applications, the two last applications that you showed us. The one where you correlate your index to the monetary shocks. Are you sure that people tweeting is aware of the fact that the 2 years size and the shock exchange right at the moment? Sometimes with the consumer expectation survey, we have difficulties to catch the reaction after the central bankers has spoken. So I don't know if this is the right direction to go. Instead, the second aspect is very interesting. There was something, again, coming out from consumer expectation survey data last year, already proving that there is a rebalancing of the that consumer rebalance their shopping away from discretionary shopping into the necessity one, even if necessity prices have gone up by more. So they need to shift from one to the other because of budget constraint. But I saw the way you have grouped the different sectors, and if I'm not wrong, you put like food and beverages together with other things that are very discretionary. I wonder whether you can do a different split of that, and it can be more happy.
So this is a bunch of stuff. The first one, in terms of monetary policy, what we're currently also working on is, first of all, I mean, one thing we could do is maybe look at to which this kind of coincides like the statements or policy statements. So I think we can work on that. But what we're currently working on is basically who actually choose. Right? So is this a consumer, is this a firm, is it a politician, is it a media guy, and so on, in order to make that statements. Right? So I think this is something that we're working on. In terms of the last point, here in this case, we are a little bit, with the aggregate data, we were a little bit constrained because this is how we got the categories. Once we have the transaction level data, we can for sure do that. Yeah, but this is not by choice, but by data. So,
the question.
Yes. Thank you very much. Just wanted to get a sense, you call this inflation expectations index. So I just want to get a sense of what period are you looking at? Are you able to figure out from the tweets whether the consumers or the people are tweeting think of this is a let's say the month ahead or 6 months ahead or 1 year ahead inflation expectation?
Oh, I think this is similar to related to the question that was also asked before. So I mean, we basically calculate that we get the tweets and we have the date stamp to understand when it was tweeted. But we cannot say anything, and then we get basically whether this is related to inflation yes or not, and the different categories that are shown. What we don't know yet, whether the tweets contain some information itself, whether this is about something forward-looking or not. And so this is we're working on that, but we haven't classified this yet because this is not that easy. You need to be very careful with what to do. But this is definitely a position.
I can see the benefit of having this high frequency index and stuff, but there, you can stop here with the question. So if we did with these other surveys, say or so, I wonder, I mean, wouldn't be a distinct advantage of this data set that you could see people talking? In other words, is there a way to see how, these inflated expectations, which are the measure spread and the population by looking at retweeting? So is that an option? Do you see something there?
It is not. We haven't done this yet. So we can also see whether things are being retweeted and who retweets. And I think this is something we want to do in the process of who tweets first, and then who's going to people what people then tweet. If it's done, for example, by someone from the journalist or so, if we start talking about something, do people just follow on? And this is probably something we should take care of. Because it's
I wouldn't say different care of it, but distinct advantage of this relative to a conventional survey.
I think Yetman has something along those lines.
Yeah. In terms of communication, I guess.
No, so tweets and retweets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Different types, households.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so thank you. 30 seconds.
But just quickly, like how many of these are actually consumer tweets versus say policy analysts, journalists, ECB?
That's what I said. This is what yeah. So it's not that easy if you find that this is a person where we know works at a newspaper, but is it just basically providing a personal tweet? Or is it a different whether it's personal or is it think a little bit about
Okay, this concludes the session. Round of applause to everyone. Thank you.